So, dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us the fourth Aviation Arena webinar. It's this time for the first time, it's talk show. I'd like to introduce, first of all, our moderator for today, Mr. Andrew Chatelain, Managing Director of Aviation Advocacy. Andrew was also moderator of our last webinar 2 weeks ago, and it was topic about recovery of the whole industry and the traffic and the passenger tourism, etc. Today with us we have Mr. Jeffrey Goch, CEO of the Star Alliance, and Kieran O'Brien, partner for KPMG Ireland. But I will not go further in the topic. I will leave this to our moderator and the speakers today. And I hope you will have a good and useful time. And please, you can ask all the questions in Q&A through the chat and so on, whatever you like. Also, I like to say that we are recording this webinar, and tomorrow you will have also the record by the mail. So have a nice time, and Andrew, please, floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Tom, and good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you are. Yet again, there's a remarkable participation from around the globe, largely in Europe, of course, but also from outside Europe as well for this conversation, because I can think of no topic that's more topical or no topic that's more interesting than this at the moment. Once upon a time, we thought we were going to be talking about the V-shaped recovery and the coronavirus. I think it's time to move on and to accept that we are where we are, and it's time to think about what normal will look like in the future. What will the new normal look like? So this is, as Tom said, the fourth Aviation Arena virtual seminar. The hope is that eventually there'll be physical seminars as well as virtual ones. But in the meantime, once a month or so, we're going to have these conversations, and I'm looking forward to them. This one has been described as a talk show, which I think means that you'll hear a lot of people talking, but somehow that'll be different to a normal webinar because there won't be PowerPoint slides, there won't be any of those sorts of things, but there will be two people who know precisely what they're talking about, and you couldn't ask for a better couple of people to speak to, brace of people to speak to. The first is Mr. Jeffrey Goch, who is the CEO, as Tom said, the CEO of the Star Alliance itself. So he is as connected as you can be with some of the world's great airlines and some of the world's very biggest airlines. And secondly, we have Kieran O'Brien, who is a partner for KPMG in Dublin. Dublin, of course, one of those remarkable aviation hubs. It's got huge fingers in finance, in operations, in all sorts of things. And who, as of course, KPMG, a consulting and accounting firm. I hope I didn't demean you, Kieran, by saying merely those two. A multi-service client-based, no doubt client-focused firm. But let me start with you, Jeffrey. If I'd have asked you a month ago what was the situation now, what would you have said?
A month ago? Well, that's an interesting question. I thought you might have asked me kind of like what it would be 5 months ago, but since we're
I can ask you that as well if you like. I mean, answer both. It's fine.
Yeah, I think, well, let's begin with 5 months ago. I don't think we would have expected to be where we are today. But where we are today compared to a month ago is a little different, but not significantly different as you look at, as you have conversations certainly with some of the airlines in terms of their planning. I will say that there has been ups and downs in terms of optimism and pessimism when it comes to planning for the airlines in the last couple of months. At the top of the crisis, I think there was somewhat great pessimism about where all these will lead to. So planning was, looking at maybe 20–30% of capacity by the end of this year. 2 months into the crisis, I think as they began to settle down in the adjustment and the adaptation periods, we're talking a little bit more bullish, 50% by the end of the year. Even IATA and ICAO, the international organizations, are predicting by the end of this year, we're looking at overall a 50% capacity for the 12-month period. But as I engage with some of our members, we are actually seeing different pockets of development. If you look at the Americas, really that is very, situation of devastation, particularly Latin America. You get a little bit of positive green shoots right now in Europe because Schengen is open up, there's pent-up demand. It fits in very nicely to the season for summer school holidays. Question then becomes is how sustainable that becomes. I was just speaking to one of our largest members yesterday. outlook continues to be fairly pessimistic post the third quarter of this year. And then you look at Asia, of course, there's been, I think, more of a progress there over the last couple of months. I think there is where you see a little bit more optimism as we come into the end of the year as the planning goes. So I think between last month and this month, there hasn't been too much of a change. Just that I think many airlines are kind of living on, I wouldn't say hand to mouth, but some are planning almost on a monthly basis. Of course, you have some that are quite visionary and long-term. They are planning, 20 years out from here. There's no reason you would suspect why Singapore Airlines would have received 12, 13 billion euros. And that is really a very far-reaching outlook from their shareholders, and state. So there are some that are really looking forward about what it would look like. And there are some that are just really trying to manage the current liquidity situation.
Yeah, are they living hand to mouth or hand out to mouth, do you think?
Depends on which way you look at it. I think there's less of hand to mouth right now because traffic is really quite poor. In spite of 10, 20, 30%, 40% capacity that we look at in the third quarter, 50% capacity in the fourth quarter. Right now, load factor is averaging somewhere between 10, 20%
really?
For our members. Yeah.
Wow. So let me see if I can sort of restate that. Within Europe, Schengen's open. We've started to get a little bit of, let me call it for want of a better expression, domestic European travel. It's obviously international travel, but it's within the European region. We're getting some domestic travel in the United States. And that's about it, actually. I mean, what's the travel in Asia?
Yeah, well, I think pockets in Asia, right? In China, it's a big domestic market. So there's traffic going on. But even with 60, 70% capacity domestic year on year, we're looking at maybe 40%, 50% load factor. That's not really a rosy program. It's good to bring the cash in, but in terms of the bottom line, it's not really a rosy picture. And I think it's a very good point. I'm sure Kieran will jump in on this, is that at least for Star Alliance, many of our members and many of the large airlines in the world are network carriers. So even if within Schengen is open up, or domestically the US is open up, or in China domestically is opened up, you are still very dependent on feed and defeed traffic, which is not forthcoming because borders are still closed, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
For all that the international organizations have been shouting for the last 2-3 months, harmonized opening up, coordinated restart, we couldn't be further away from the truth. Yeah. I mean, we are just as disorganized as we were when the lockdowns first came in March. And so those that are network operators have a problem for feed and defeat.
Yeah. And actually, it probably exacerbates the problem, because the reality is that, if you look at particularly the large network carriers, their margin, their profit, their whole financial engineering is based on that overall picture. So this, like the ability to pick and choose, we'll open this, we'll open that doesn't solve the problem. Arguably, they're incurring greater fixed costs because of that to open bits as opposed to nothing or everything, if that makes sense. So it's a pretty bad scenario for the larger players, because it's very hard to turn on and off like a tap. And particularly then, if you look at some of the pressure that the big flag carriers were put under by governments, it's really hard to pick and choose what you do and the timing around that. And I think the point that was made, that Jeffrey made earlier on about people currently working in the now and people looking at the future, I think that's exactly right. And I think the reality is we see lots of airlines starting to split their thinking into two and actually creating two separate teams. On one hand, they need to understand, how do I get through this, I won't say without pain, but by limiting the damage as best I can, and what are the actions I can take in the now to do that, and arguably delaying starting flying until I can get enough across my entire network to justify, right, to hit that minimum level, is probably a realistic target for some. And we've definitely seen that from some airlines in Asia, where they could theoretically start flying, but they're really trying to limit that. Versus we clearly see airlines going, well, okay, how often am I going to get a scenario whereby I can actually look at my process, look at my operations, start to take cost out on a meaningful thing. So like 2 years ago, you know, if we were talking to airlines, and I'd include airports in this as well, right? Digital transformation was this nice, colorful word where I'll have a few pilot projects and I'll put it up on the web and it'll be deadly. But fundamentally, it was around branding. The conversation now is, well, actually, I now have the opportunity to not disrupt my process and actually, you know, think about that longer picture and make really meaningful change in a controlled environment. But you have to have the bandwidth and the belief that you'll be here to comfortably operate in a year's time to do that. So I think it's really interesting, but it's given people that opportunity, but this, you know, there's still lots of pain to go through before that, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think this half open, half on thing is nearly worse than closed versus open, if that makes sense.
Wow.
And Andrew, if I may just jump
Please,
into what Eric said, is that, you know, I guess we start from the basis that never waste a crisis, right? And so, you know, you make use of one. And I think that those opportunities are so wide-ranging, beyond just your operations and cost structure. It's also about your network. It's also about your investment portfolio. As I look at some of our members and other airlines as well, where the dependency has so much been on international traffic, sixth freedom traffic, from Cathay Pacific to Singapore Airlines to Copa Airlines, where you have no significant domestic market to rely on. And I think some hard questions are going to be asked in a world in future where borders can just go up and come down so very quickly. What's my business model? What's my network model going forward? So I think there's a big ask in terms of strategic thinking going forward for many of these airlines.
I'm so happy we're talking about this. This is exactly the area that I'm most interested in. And there's so much to unpack, isn't there? There's the issue of individual airlines, and Kieran was talking about this to some extent, individual airlines that have got to look at their internal processes, their internal costs, their internal procedures, their network, all sorts of things, and are starting to make changes. And we're watching that. We're watching airlines retrench people and make some very hard decisions. And as Kieran said again, you know, even taking a decision as to whether we start at all or where we do and how we do it. And then there's sort of broader, if you like, industry reform as well. And at the moment, we seem to be in the place where perhaps, or maybe we're in phase 2 of 3, where phase 1 was the sort of immediate panic. As I like to say, what we've done here is we've put the word panic into pandemic. And there was that immediate panic thing. And then we've sort of got now to the stage where some of the airlines are reforming internally. My question to both of you, I guess first to you, Jeffrey, is when does the industry look up to the horizon and say, wait a minute, the whole system is broken, or the whole system is, sorry, broken was probably the wrong word. The whole system is capable of being much more efficient, much better, and reformed. When are we going to look up to the horizon, do you think?
Well, I mean, I'd like to be more optimistic, you know, than the reality is actually. And you know, as I alluded to, you know, international organizations, really, this is where coordination begins. But for all the screams and the shouts from the top of the hill about, you know, coordination and harmonization, we're not seeing anywhere near to that. And it's a big ask in trying to say, we all agree that this is, to use your words, the broken part, and the industry now needs to coalesce together and make sure that we address those. I still think that we are unfortunately going to see developments that are not parallel. You know, just because countries and economies are at different stages of this particular crisis right now. I mean, you know, Latin Americans are very, very hard hit even before this crisis. So even if you talk about improvements in customer experience, automation, better ATC, for instance, that requires investments, Andrew, as you know very well. And at this time, it's very hard for them to see beyond, you know, not to be unkind, to see beyond, you know, your own nose, right? And to see what the future looks like.
Well, I agree with that. But just to pick up on one of the things you said there, at the moment, the screams that we're getting from on high for harmonisation or whatever, I still get the feeling they are screams for harmonisation to go back to the way things used to be. My question is, when do we start looking at the new normal instead of pretending we can stick to the old normal?
Yeah, and I wonder, is that once things open up, right? And So at the minute, if you think about the kind of the ecosystem, everybody at the minute can just go, well, everything is COVID related because I can't fly, I can't do anything, there's nobody going through my airport, etc., etc., and everything is about COVID, and it's an external rationale to cover a lot of internal problems, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
But as that starts to free up, and I'm not an economist, right? So, but you know, the general concept is there will be less people traveling for the certainly short to medium term, and that's when I think the reality needs to hit, because if we have a load of aviation businesses, right, and I'm not exclusively talking about airlines, who will struggle to make ends meet in the new reality of reduced volume, that is when we're going to have to see change, because it will be a change or don't exist scenario. And I think, you know, point you made and the concept about harmonization, you know, that's really hopefully where we'll get a voice and a drive to do that, because it's around, you know, it's around this, and we see it, right? We have a load of, or we have a number of startups that we see around, you know, route profitability, about using AI for maintenance, AI for planning, AI for cost, AI for customer experience, all of these things. But you know, and harmonization is not just about regulatory or flying, but it's around, can I pool services? And I think Jeffrey and Star Alliance is a really interesting proposition. You know, I think they're in a unique position to really support their members by maybe doing something different. But that's probably the level of thinking that it needs to be, that level of strategy to move things forward. Because in a world where, you know, okay, we had, you know, 14 really good years in the aviation sector, but for lots of parts, it was never a high margin business. So if we have lower factors, you know, unless airlines can pivot and change quickly, that's probably going to be a problem. So there will need to be change. There will need to be drive. And I think that'll need to happen as soon as we start flying, when it opens up, because that's when the reality hits. At the minute, I can blame COVID. But post-COVID, when I go back, I'm left with the harsh reality. And frankly, there's a really nice ecosystem at the minute whereby nobody wants to press the big red button in the corner, because it starts an avalanche of big red button pressing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But at some point, that's going to change. And you know, I guess in a perfect world, we'll have the cause and the action on harmonization, and I mean that across every aspect, hopefully taking place before we start getting into that. Or otherwise, you know, things will get worse before they get better.
Yeah. I think one of the changes, and it'd be interesting to see as these all pans out, like probably not in the short term, but medium to long term, is, you know, the industry has always, even pre-crisis, right? Everyone is talking about growth. No one would expect that this crisis to come in. And I think that's a huge mindset change from a growth environment to a really negative environment here. But for years after years, Andrew, as you know, is that, you know, getting capacity was very cheap, credit was very good, aircraft was coming on board all the time, and is not necessarily always in line with GDP growth. And then when downturn comes, that's when the aircraft is delivered, and so you got a big mismatch. I think that going forward, airlines are going to be much more careful in managing their capacity in terms of forward orders and, you know, aircraft orders, because I just got off a call with one of our members. You know, as any other airline, they're looking to dislodge capacity, you know, give back aircraft, and you know. And you have problems now with asset valuation, particularly across the Atlantic, where, you know, you are putting aircraft as collateral, for example, and then now you look at the balance sheet, the value isn't quite much the collateral that was given. No. So I think that's one of the probably structural changes that airlines will be very keen to apply as they move forward and break away from that cycle.
Yeah. But again, Jeffrey, that's, I mean, I think there's sort of concentric circles of change or reform, or maybe they're not concentric, but circles of change and reform, where the first one is, as I say, airlines retrenching I wish I hadn't used that word, retreating within themselves and tidying up their own house, and including looking at capacity and how many aircraft they have and whatsoever. The second one perhaps then is well, there are two more that I can think of. I'm not sure of the order. One is to do exactly what Kieran just mentioned, using your sort of services as an alliance of airlines to start to do things in a common way, which is interesting because you're not the only alliance, of course. So do we land up at a place where we have a somewhat more fragmented aviation industry where Star is doing it one way and One World is doing it a different way, and so forth, which will be an interesting outcome and frankly more competitive, which may be a good thing. But then there's the sort of layer outside that again, isn't there, where we start to look at consolidation. Surely we're going to get to a place where there's consolidation either within the alliances or outside the alliances. And then outside that again, there's the, you know what, the whole industry is broken. We need to fix this. Because even if you look back to the glory days of the 1st of January this year, remember the good old days of the 1st of January? IATA's figures are that there were 30 only profitable airlines in the world. Now, most of them were your members, so that's good news for you. But the point remains that it wasn't as if this was the golden industry doing marvellous things. There were only 30 profitable airlines. So are you seeing your members, Jeffrey, starting to think about the sort of things that Kieran's talking about, those sorts of forming it up inside the alliance?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this was already happening before the crisis, the JVs and, the marriages that we have. For me, I think going forward, as I hear from the members, is that networks are going to shrink on an individual carrier level. And if you continue to want to be a network player, you need to have friends and you need to have partners. And this is where I see there's more cementation of relationships as you change from a wide body aircraft to a narrow body aircraft operator. You're concentrating in your region, but that may not necessarily be your panacea. You still need your international friends to give you the connectivity for the feed and the defeed. And this is where I think, from an alliance perspective, this comes in very, very useful for the relationships that have been built over the years. And that's certainly one thing that will change. But the other thing I would add, Andrew, is what this crisis has done, perhaps in one way, is to navel gaze and say, can we continue to charge €4.99 for a Vienna-Frankfurt flight? Leaving aside the questions about sustainability and how irresponsible that is and so on, I think that is going to be capacity is a function of that, clearly, right? We can charge $4.99. Those are the hard questions I think the industry needs to ask, whether or not we can be sustainable at $4.99, for instance. And that's just not. I don't think that is the right future.
Yeah.
And I think, Jeffrey, that's a really good point. And I think that's across everything. I'm pretty certain there's a whole lot of lessors going, we probably can't maintain the current lease rate factors either, right? Yeah. Because, I think that's the reality, right? That ultimately we hid behind volume, or we pushed a lot of these problems behind it. It's a volume game, and I'll grow and I'll do more, right? And look, that's out the window for the next little bit anyway. But I think you are right. I think fundamentally this is going to be about the relationships I maintain and I keep. And I think the role of Star Alliance, it's hugely important, because that allows people to kind of play by safe rules within that group. And I think we certainly foresee a significant amount of M&A or even for pseudo M&A, i.e. JV, sidecars, all of this stuff. And again,
sorry, just to be clear, M&A, that's accountant talk for consolidation, right?
Yeah, sorry, apologies. Yeah. And ultimately we see it across the entire ecosystem, right? Not just in the airlines, but I think we'll see a combination of services. I'm not sure we see a whole load of vertical integration, actually, right? I think we still see it more on a horizontal plane, but there's no question that with, like, in the end of the day, this is still going to be okay. It won't be $4.99, maybe it'll be $59.99, but it's still not going to triple my margin, right? So I still need to try to get a level of volume, and the way to do that is around alliances and growth and manage it that way. But that's why it'll drive that, I think.
Interesting. Can I ask you, I mean, you very rightly, Kieran, and I thank you for it, mentioned the entire ecosystem of aviation. So you're seeing a lot of activity in the airports. How do you see the airports? What sort of airport M&A will there be?
I think I think that's interesting, right? Because an awful lot of the airports are state-owned or certainly state-invested. So I think it's a much tougher concept to do consolidation in that. But I think what we do have is we have a number of larger players. And I might just, as an example, right? So, you know, in Ireland, we have the Dublin Airport Authority, or DAA, right? And actually they have an international branch that does lots of duty free and manages lots of duty free and helps others. And I think that's the type of thing you'll see people potentially, you know, carving off parts of the airport and using those as assets to kind of, you know, I'm going to give that to this person for 10 years and a group is going to run those for lots of airports and try to do it that way. Now, that's not to rule out kind of consolidation. I just think it's a harder space because of the level of state ownership and state sponsorship that occurs. An awful lot of airports are, you know, enshrined in the state and the location, so that's tougher. But services, portions, I think you could see that being done where, you know, again, volume is interesting. I think what we are seeing an awful lot of push by certain airlines is really pushing the innovation angle, how they look at customer experience, how they think about services, how they think about management, you know, getting the most out of that asset, that runway, that infrastructure, and really sweating it, because that is a high investment, long run asset, right?
If there are fewer airlines and fewer flights, sweating the asset becomes increasingly hard, doesn't it?
Exactly.
I mean, I suspect that at the moment the airport business model is to attract as many airlines as possible.
Yeah.
Given that you know, if we all accept that there's probably going to be fewer airlines and fewer flights in the future, perhaps their business model has to change to making one airline or maybe one airline alliance literally dominate at this airport. Now that ought to change the power relationship, the power balance between the airport and the airlines as well.
And I think another thing we see is, you know, there was a big push by certain really large economies to create mega hub and spoke systems, right? So, you know, one, for example, I'm going to build 360 regional aircraft. I'm going to bring it in, or regional airports. I'm going to bring it into a number of central locations. So I think you will also have a push on the quality of service that airport delivers. So how easy is it for me to turn around my aircraft? How easy is it for me as an airline to be efficient? So I think we'll end up in a competitive bit where the quality of service I deliver, so make it easy for airlines to fly into me, will really drive that. But yeah, look, we'll have less, but I think we'll have an awful lot more regional and speed of turnaround, quality of service. All of those things will be really important.
What you've actually just said is the airport is going to have to take over control of the control tower, as a matter of fact, because if the ANSP continues to run it outside the control of the airport itself, there's always going to be a massive disconnect there. I'm all in favour of that, hasten to add. But Jeffrey, can I maybe just go back to you and ask, are these sorts of issues that Kieran's talking about, that I'm talking about, airports and how you'll address airports and ANSPs, are they things that your members are thinking about now?
Less so from the ANSP perspective, Andrew, but certainly at the airport level. I mean, there are multifaceted conversations happening at the same time. Just yesterday, I came up a call with one of the largest members about indications of some airports trying to push charges up. Clearly for the reason of the diseconomies of scale right now with high assets, high costs, but fewer airlines and passengers coming through. But that really boils down to another point that I was, trying to add on to what Kieran was saying, is that when you talk about M&As in the airport environment, I think that's very difficult because for economics and geographic reasons, there's really no competition that really is an imperative for mergers and acquisition. In a way, the synergies are not that compelling as it would be between, say, two airlines, right? And so as I look at some of the airports, what they're doing, some are trying to raise charges, some are actually incentivizing. The more passengers you bring in for the next period, we're going to give you a discount, and so on and so forth. And so each is just trying to drive their agenda to attract business or attract revenue at the end of the day, right? And the question is which means you do that. So I think M&A on the airport side is probably a challenge that we're looking at. More cooperation in terms of synergies and best practices probably will happen. But on the airline side, I was going to throw this question at you, because M&A, I think maybe pre-crisis in the airline world could be something that could be still progressive and happening. But in a world where so many of the airlines today are state-owned from the bailout and the state support, I suspect that there is one big term and condition in that bailout is that this money cannot be used to acquire another airline. And so you then kind of layer back down to more of joint ventures than at the mergers and acquisitions level, I suspect, at the airline. And for us, from an Star Alliance perspective, and I think, and I won't speak for the other alliances, in that over the last 20 odd years or so, what we've built are really tools that enables that partnership, that friendship to be cemented even more. And these tools really come into play very handily now, because to reinvest in many of these tools that hold the partnerships together is not something that you're going to do. And this is where I think we're going to see more of these relationships kind of get stronger and more robust.
Do you see that then turning into a fragmentation, if you like, of the industry? I mean, historically we had industry standard procedures designed through IATA, Interline, and what have you. Do you see that as sort of splitting into 3 different sets of alliances, sets of procedures? No,
I don't think so. And so if I just take one very simple example, Kieran talked about customer experience, automation, and I think biometrics is one example. We continue to look to IATA to set the standard for biometrics. Right. We are simply bringing the hardware and the software to it that will comply with the standard that no matter which airport you go to at some point is all transportable or portable standards. But of course, an international organization like IATA or ICAO, as you know, Andrew, well, it takes time for things to happen. And so, there have been occasions when we have driven the drafting, the crafting, and the adoption of standards. And we like to think that certainly in the area of biometrics, this is where we might also be driving the adoption of the standards.
So just on that point, to help one of the questions over on the chat side there, do you see that then similarly going to happen in some of the health standards and the PPE requirements and things like that?
Well, funny you should ask that question. Over the course of the last, I'd say 10 days maybe, we actually have been in conversations with OneWorld and SkyTeam about, what can we do, because this is a non-competitive arena, non-competitive environment, of how can we raise standards of hygiene and health safety to restore confidence in air travel. About 10 days ago, SkyTeam released their Sky Protect Charter, which is about what they commit to. And then about a week later, we released our set of commitments, very, very specific commitments about your experience and expectation across whichever Star Alliance carrier you fly. You can expect a care kit, or you can expect your fellow passengers to be wearing masks and so on. And then just yesterday, OneWorld release their own set as well. And you will see an announcement tomorrow in relation to something that we're releasing to wrap all this together. And so from a hygiene and safety perspective, I think there's no competitive gain out of this. It's for public health reasons, right? But if you're talking about my biometric system is 10 seconds faster than the other, there's a competitive environment behind that. But really, this is we're talking about public health. There's really no, we should have an international kind of a standard or platform from which to operate.
Right.
And Jeffrey, I might just go back to your question in relation to kind of the consolidation piece. And there was a question raised whether we'll see the US style consolidation in Europe. And I think your point is exactly right. We have much more state-owned, as in different states, right, owning aircraft as opposed to our airlines. So I think consolidation is more difficult due to structural impediments. Having said that, we've seen it before. I think it would depend actually on the rationale behind the consolidation. So as we've seen with a number of the European state bailouts, jobs and job protection is a core rationale and driver of that. So if that was the rationale behind the consolidation, I think you could end up getting there, but I think it's harder, which is why I go back to that point around this pseudo kind of consolidation around alliances, JVs. I really do believe that we'll see more of that. And on the one hand, it hopefully allows me to access some of the synergies I'd get through a consolidation, but not necessarily taking on that balance sheet risk. And I think at the minute, back to a point you raised earlier around, you know, forward orders and owning aircraft. Ironically, while we may have, at least for the next little while, a smaller proportion of aircraft flying, I think we may have a higher proportion of leased aircraft. So if I think back to the ecosystem of the lessors, I think there's a bigger percentage of the flying fleet to play for, because if I was an airline, I'd really, really not want balance sheet risk at the minute, right? And frankly, I won't want it for years. Which is, why would I do that, right? So I think things like the aircraft I own, I think M&A via JV or alliance, where I'm not taking on the balance sheet risk of, you know, having to take all those people and all those issues and combine it. I think that's a pretty attractive proposition for any airline at the moment.
Thank you, and thank you for getting me back on subjects. Just that I just wanted to pursue the PPE point for a moment, but you're absolutely right, Kieran, and thank you. The ecosystem for aviation is much broader than just the airlines, the airports, and the ANSPs, isn't it? It's the leasing companies. There's all sorts of things that go off in other directions as well. And I think your point about the leasing companies is exactly right. Are you seeing the risk, if that's the right word, are you seeing the possibility of consolidation in the leasing market as well?
I think it's very early days for the leasing market, right? I think then they, the same as everybody else, is just are working through the current crisis. But you know, it's an industry that's really adept at working through these things, but it's also an industry that has M&A at a constant level. So yeah, I think there's probably lots of lessors out there who see this as a genuine opportunity. And you know, loads of them have been through downturns before, so there's probably an opportunity for growth, for accessing value in an industry that's been hard to access value for the last couple of years. So yeah, I think it's, for lots of people, you know, this probably represents a real period of opportunity. And yeah, I think like anything, I think coming out of a downturn, right, and let's be realistic, this is a downturn, there'll be M&A opportunity or consolidation opportunity for every aspect of this.
It's a vertiginous downturn, as a matter of fact. My next question, and again, Jeffrey knows that I'm always going to ask this: why are we so fatalistic about our inability to change the ownership and control rules? It's as if the Chicago Convention was actually originally written in wet clay using the end of a reed or something. You know, was it originally in hieroglyphics? I mean, it seems impossible to change. Why aren't we using this, the most downturnish downturn in the history of the world, to change the fundamental structures? Why do we keep on being so fatalistic?
Well, I think, you know, and this was my thesis 40 years ago, right? But you know, it's politics, it's national interest, it's national security. When words like political interest, national security come, there's just it's a dial-up of death, right? I mean, you just can't go forward with that. You know, we have some members that are yet to receive any states. And one of the concerns for the state support is that the majority of the current owners of that airline are foreigners. Okay, so why should we bail out an airline that is majority owned by foreigners and taking the taxpayers' money when we have public health problems, housing problems, education problems, power generation problems? So
it's a really good question.
You know, so those are key, you know, kind of everyday question to the man and the woman on the street, right? And so when you throw all these things in, I think this crisis actually probably been more of a reason to protect the national interest than it is to actually open up on your, you know, ownership and control rules.
And that's actually, I mean, we've only got a few minutes left, but that's actually another really big risk, isn't it? That in one crisis, we're going to get rid of 2 decades worth of reform. I think it's just going to be a complete catastrophe.
There were a number of studies, well, I wouldn't say studies, but kind of reports, and some of them are more bullish than others, you know, that headlined along the lines that the losers are now the winners, right? So you have airlines that probably were pre-crisis facing financial challenges that because of this crisis could be in better shape than those who were in good shape, you know, prior to the crisis.
Absolutely, down from the Omega. I mean, It seems to me like a complete tragedy, I have to say. And the risk we run is that we get back to this very nationalistic 1944 view of the world, and we'll start negotiating at a national level as well.
Well, if you look at the air bubbles and travel bridges, are we not more or less heading down that road?
Of course we are. That is precisely the road we now head upon. Precisely the road. And that will, you've got to think, Kieran, that over time that will impact the value and the marketability of airlines as well, surely, to go back to that old world, the even older than old normal, the original normal.
I think that's right. I think it has to. And I think ultimately, right, all the things that Jeffrey's talked about, that you've talked about, right, and then, you know, how airlines and aviation businesses adapt over the next while, I think is really interesting, right? What are the items that would create value for shareholders and stakeholders going forward? And I think it's that ability to be adaptable, right? To relook at network and route profitability, the ability to find other drivers than volume for extracting margin. And I think, you know, you may go back looking at, you know, who were the people who were innovative in terms of driving, you know, kind of margin, right? And ancillary areas for profit and revenue, I think, will be more important going forward than they have been, because I think in the past, you know, oh, well, will I sell a credit card or will I just do another route, right? Whereas now, well, actually, I kind of need to look at that in its holistic approach. And what we actually see people looking at, and apologies for this one, but we see people going back to think about zero-based budgeting, which seems kind of crazy. But one of the fundamentals of zero-based budgeting is actually, it's not about reducing my cost. It's about ensuring that I put my money or my budget into the right areas of investment. What is going to drive shareholder, stakeholder value? What am I putting my money in to give me a return? And that's actually the key driver. And I think everything's on the table now. And the people, the airlines and the businesses that are able to look at that entire ecosystem, are able to forecast that effectively, understand their cost drivers, but more importantly, their revenue and their margin drivers. And that's what I think will drive that value. But if they stick in the, I just need more planes and more people, I don't think that's going to fly for the next while.
Yeah, sadly, zero-based budgeting is actually about zero revenue, not about zero costs. Yeah. Gentlemen, we are out of time. Can I just ask you perhaps one last question, ask each of you the same question. 12 months from now, no, sorry, that's an unfair question. 6 months from now, is there going to be much change? And if so, what's it going to look like? Maybe, Kieran, start with you, and then we can go from there.
I think if most countries are back flying, then I think there will be a change, because I think we'll start to understand what the new normal looks like, and the new normal is definitely not the old normal. So I think we'll see change. If we end up in things like second waves and we can still kind of, you know, blame COVID, maybe not. But I think we're probably moving past that now. So yeah, I think there'll be change. As to what that is, I won't hazard a guess to that, but it'll definitely be different.
The big question. And Jeffrey, last word to you.
Yeah, I think a little diverted from Kieran's there. I think that if there's any change, it's probably going to be marginal between here and the end of the year. And I think there is so much uncertainty surrounding what's going to happen in the next 6 months that is going to characterize the volatility or involatility of the whole situation. We here, in fact, in Star Alliance, are preparing for a scenario where the recovery is stalled. You know, we talked about U, we talked about V, we talked about the L. You know, have we thought about a U that was coming to a W, but that drops significantly lower than the first U? And I think there is a concern about that. You know, the second wave coming on, the trade dispute between China and US is ongoing. The US is retreating. You know, you've got a presidential election coming at the end of the year. I think all that has a part to play as to how those 6 months are going to turn out. And therefore, I think if there was going to be change, probably marginal for all the factors we talked about, right? Business travel not likely to return anytime soon. Leisure travel in the northern summer, great stuff, but is it sustainable? September, October, November, that's the lowest period of the industry season usually, and that's going to be the litmus test.
Right. So basically, what you're saying is we should give up using the Anglophone alphabet and start learning Thai or something, one of those letters that drops very long way down.
Whatever the character is.
I'm not sure. I don't think I want to know. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Kieran. Thank you, Jeffrey. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you found this as interesting as I have. We've used up all of our time. Thank you for your participation, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Jeffrey.
Thank you.